It's great to see some familiar faces back. Thank you so much for continuing to join us each week. My name is Kelsey Ostergren. I am joined by actually a few of my colleagues today. So Jerry Hineker and Kim Heft, who you know, and our guest speaker for today, who's also a member of the Superior Health team, Mia Croyle. And so we're excited to offer today's webinar, again, as part of our ongoing roundtable discussion, just these short little education bursts to highlight some important aspects of COVID-19 and of the vaccinations there. So as I mentioned, we have Mia Croyle with us today, who will be discussing motivational interviewing and how we can use that approach to have maybe some difficult conversations with our staff, with our peers, maybe even out in the community or at home, and how we can use some of those strategies to improve our vaccination rates. As always, a few housekeeping announcements before I kick it over to Mia. Slides for today's presentation are available. We will drop the link to those in the chat. As a reminder, at the end of our call, we will have a quick event survey. As always, we really want your feedback to make sure that we're giving you education that's relevant and meaningful and impactful for you. So if it's not, we want to know. If it is, we also want to know. So we would appreciate if you could just take a couple minutes to do that. And again, we'll drop the link towards the end of our call today. And as Mia's talking, please feel free to use the chat box. If there's questions that come up, or you need her to expand on something or share a different perspective, please feel free to use that. We will be monitoring it, and we have no problem stopping Mia and just having her kind of rehash some of that. So again, welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. Mia, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And with that, I will turn the floor over to you.
Great, thanks, Kelsey, and thank you everybody for joining. I know that this time of the pandemic has just been so taxing on us in so many ways. And as leadership in nursing homes, even probably more so for you, but you're asked to lead in a lot of different ways. One of the ways is, around vaccination and really, being recognized as both a sort of formal management style leader, but also a thought leader. And I know if any of you are like me, as Kelsey sort of already referenced to, we might be, in addition to in the workplace, having conversations with people who we manage or supervise, with peers, but also out in the community with other people that we come in contact with our families and other people that we're close to. And these conversations about vaccines are generally not easy conversations. So our hope is that today we're just going to give you a little taste of motivational interviewing and look at it through the particular lens of like, how can it just help us be as effective as possible in those conversations? So as just by way of background, if you've never heard of motivational interviewing before, it's a particular style of communication or approach. It focuses very much on partnership and being collaborative. It really does work on drawing out the other person's motivation. When I hear motivational interviewing, I almost think about, when I hear motivational, the first thing that comes into my mind is like a motivational speaker. And motivational interviewing is not necessarily that. We're not trying to supply someone with motivation. We're really helping and aiming to help them access their own internal motivation and to apply that to whatever the topic at hand is. So there's sort of on the slide, you'll see the fancy schmancy jargon filled definition, and then the more boots on the ground definition of just, it's a way that we can support people as we talk to them about potential behavior changes where they might not be certain about the best way forward. And there is a large evidence base that supports motivational interviewing as an effective communication style. Not going to get into that with today. We don't have time or I think a need for that. But if that's an area that you're interested in, please feel free to reach out and I can share more with you about what some of the research is. Go ahead to the next slide. So a few key concepts that I think are useful from the motivational interviewing approach. I'm going to share with you. And I just want to clarify that, in no way is anyone expecting you to be able to quote unquote do motivational interviewing coming out of this really brief taste, but hopefully there are some take homes that will be useful for you. So the first concept that has been very useful for me to keep in mind with these and other difficult conversations is just this idea of psychological reactants. And that's a really, it sounds very like a highfalutin concept, but what it talks about is just our tendency as human beings to not want to feel like our choices are being taken away. We tend to react negatively if we're to being told what to do. As humans, we are, sort of well attuned to threats, and we generally perceive that loss of autonomy or loss of sort of control over ourselves as a threat. And when we perceive a threat as human beings, we respond with that sort of fight or flight response. And so you may notice that in some conversations around vaccines, if someone feels like they're sort of being pushed into a corner, you might notice some of that fight or flight. And hopefully they're not like putting fists up to physically fight you, but you may notice people getting argumentative or more defensive. You may notice people just trying to slip out of the conversation. Yeah, I'll talk about it with my doctor, a lot of avoidance techniques. And so that is a natural response to the fact that we're doing something or that they're perceiving as a threat to their own, ability to make choices and control. Go ahead to the next slide. And what we find is the true sort of state of being that for most people who have not yet gotten their vaccines is some level of ambivalence. And ambivalence is just the state of sort of feeling two ways about something. I think about it like a teeter-totter, right? So we've got all our arguments on one side of the teeter-totter that might be arguments for getting the vaccine. And then we have all our arguments on the other side of the teeter-totter that are our arguments against getting the vaccine. And, we may have one side weighing more heavily than the other, or we may see just sort of this teetering back and forth and that sort of chronic indecision. What we hope to do is help people develop their case for making the change or getting the vaccine. And what we know is that the best way to do that is a partnering, compassionate approach. So we think about how we approach them as being indicative and really instrumental in promoting that change. There's been some really interesting research that was done around what in motivational interviewing terms we call the change talk or status quo talk, or sometimes it's called sustained talk. And they've looked at, sessions or conversations with people, not particularly around vaccines, but I think most of this work was done early on in the area of alcohol and drug conversations. And what they found is that if the person, the therapist or the person using motivational interviewing switched it on and off, they could see the amount of change talk turning on and off as well. So if you are going at people with a highly confrontive approach, if you're arguing with them, if you're trying to sort of convince them that you're the expert and not them, we see a lot more status quo talk, a lot more arguments for keeping things the same or not making a change. And if we come to them in a partnering way, a very listening approach, a compassionate approach, showing empathy for their current situation, we see more of that change talk. And what we also see is that that change talk then translates into more change outside of the conversation. So not just are they saying things, right? But then they're actually doing things differently as well. You can go to the next slide. So, keeping in mind, if we're using a motivational interviewing mindset, keeping in mind as we go into these conversations about vaccinations, that our purpose is to increase their motivation for getting it. Our purpose is not to convince them or persuade them. If I'm depending on what my purpose, my intention is as I go into the conversation, I might behave pretty differently. Like if my job is to convince them, coerce them, and twist their arm, I'm going to go in with a much different approach than if my purpose is to hear where they're at and help, figure out, is there a way that they want to move forward from that spot? And we want to think about in these conversations, and I will totally just own this, that this is a challenge for me at times as well, that regardless of the other person, where they're at, what they're saying they've decided to do, the arguments that they're making, what's on their teeter totter on either side, we know that the most effective approach is one that relies heavily on this partnering or collaborative approach, really being very accepting of where they are, and then drawing out their own individual sources of motivation, which may be very different from my own sources of motivation. You can go ahead. So partnership is the first of those, and we want to always be communicating respect, a sense of mutual trust, and collaboration. We want to show interest, a compassionate curiosity in the other person's point of view. What are they thinking? What has been their experiencing? What are they feeling? And just recognizing that as we come together in conversation, we're both bringing something of value. And so we want to honor both what we bring as well as what the other person brings to that conversation. Namely, that they're an expert on themselves and their own life. We'll go to the next slide. Acceptance. This is a challenging one for me. And really, when we talk about acceptance, it's just this idea of sort of accepting that they're in charge and they're in control of the choices that they make. So we can explicitly say things that communicate the spirit of acceptance, things like it's your choice, only you could decide what's right for you. And we want to try to maintain that approach no matter how close or far from our own personal viewpoint that person's viewpoints are. We want to try to stay out of a space of judging them for their opinions and their ideas and their feelings, and really keeping in that non-reactive stance. So that basically means I'm going to stay calm, cool, and collected and approach them with compassion and empathy. No matter what, I'm not going to let them get me all riled up. And we want to enhance their experience of power and control. And, this goes back to what we talked about with the psychological reactants. This can help take some of the power out of that psychological reactants by just reinforcing their own autonomy and our support for that autonomy. And what we find sort of paradoxically is that when the other person doesn't feel like they have to push against us, they don't have to push back, then they can let their guard down a little bit. And that is really when we can enter into productive dialogue. That might be when you notice a shift of them seeming more receptive to information or feedback. You can go ahead to the next slide. And then one of our key skills in in this realm that helps us communicate that acceptance is affirmations. So affirmations are a little bit different than praise, but it's really noticing the other person's efforts or their strengths, resources, and values, and highlighting those things that we notice that could support their a decision in the future to get vaccinated. We offer them as a statement, not a question. And often we just structure them up by starting with the word you. So the next slide has some examples of that. And you can go ahead and we might say to someone, you really care about this, or you feel deeply about this. You've really been thinking about this a lot. You've really been weighing this decision. Your commitment to your health is obvious. You're thoughtful in your decision making. You want the best for your family's health. You're someone who makes up your own mind. Right? So thinking these are things that I can genuinely affirm in someone, even if I feel like, they have inaccurate information or they've come to the wrong conclusion or the things that they're afraid of, they shouldn't be, right? No matter what I sort of feel, the judgments I may level against that person, these are all still things that are valuable and that I really do want to affirm. And what we find is that, people don't expect, if they're disagreeing with us, people don't expect us to affirm them in any way. They don't expect us to do the effort of sort of looking for and finding the good in them. And so when we do that and when we call it out, a couple different things happen. One, we're showing them, not just telling them, but showing them that we value them and we value their perspective and we think that they are good and valuable. Also, I think that the effort it takes to identify something to affirm and then offer it out loud back to the other person shifts something internally within me. And if you work on offering affirmations, I just invite you to notice it may also shift something internally with you. And it's so much easier to get into a partnering, non-judgmental place when I've done the work of finding something to affirm and really recognizing that and owning that. Now, I will say about affirmations that we have to be careful because if they are not genuine, and if we can't deliver them in a way that we trust that they will sound genuine and land in a genuine way for the other person, then they come off as snarky and sarcastic, and that defeats every purpose. So I encourage you to try to at least think of an affirmation that you could share with someone who you've had difficult conversations with in the past. And if you can't think of one, then skip it. Right. So my encouragement is you might want to give these affirmations a try. But if you're unsure about whether you genuinely feel it, don't do it. An example of that is I was doing some training in MI with community corrections, so probation and parole agents. And after the first day of training, they came back and they had a follow-up training. So one of them came back, and I will tell you, he wasn't really a true believer, but he came back to tell me, I gave this thing a try that you said about the affirmations. And I said, oh, tell me. And he said, it didn't happen. It didn't go well at all. I said, well, tell me about what it was. And he said, well, I was supervising roadside trash pickup. And so I was bored. So I thought I would just give this thing I learned about a try. Best time to do it is when you're bored, right? And he said, I just told the guys, like, good job. You're doing a good job picking up that trash. And I said, well, can I ask you a question about that? And he was like, sure. So did you genuinely feel like they were doing a good job? He's like, I mean, no. And I was like, so probably part, and I'm like, probably part of the problem was that, people are able to detect when we don't really genuinely feel or believe what we're saying. So if you can deliver them without snark, which is always my challenge, right? How do I just make sure my tone is very neutral and accepting and make sure I really feel this affirmation that I'm wanting to share with the other person? I'm going to push you to try to stretch and deliver some affirmations within the context of those challenging conversations. The next slide. So the third thing we said, we really want to keep in mind as we go through these more challenging conversations is evoking. So evoking is just, drawing out the more from the other person. So a lot of times in our professions, we're in a telling mode. So we like to tell people what they should know and what they should do. And really, this is much more of an asking and listening mode. So we want to draw out the other person's point of view. And we know that as we work to do that, we will hear more of their own genuine motivation. Part of our job is to create opportunities for the other person to feel safe and brave enough to give voice to their own arguments for the change. So for getting vaccinated. And we know that people have to feel safe before they can really talk about both sides of that teeter-totter and what's on both sides. And so we have to create that atmosphere of safety. We also don't want it to feel so safe that we don't encourage them to keep moving forward. So go ahead. So here's some examples of questions you might ask to get them talking. So from what you know, what might be some of the risks of not getting vaccinated for you? What would have to happen for you to feel ready to get the vaccine? If you were comfortable that the vaccine was safe for you, how would being vaccinated impact your day-to-day life? If you were to decide to get vaccinated, what would be your most compelling reason? Right? So if they're telling you all their reasons for not getting a vaccination, then we could hear all that and acknowledge that all those things are present for them, and then shift the conversation a little bit by asking a question that really invites them to tell us, what would some of your reasons for getting vaccinated be? What's on the other side of that teeter-totter? That second bullet, I really should shift the order on this slide because I like that question as sort of a response to someone who we've done some good work. We've asked some of these other questions and they're saying like, nope, I'm not going there. I'm not giving you a lot of change talk. I'm not identifying a lot of reasons for change. Then that last question is sort of our sort of one more effort, one more go at it, right? What would have to happen for you to feel ready to get that vaccine? And it might be something that they've identified has to happen in terms of the vaccine. It may be something that they've identified has to happen in terms of their life. It may be the answer to that question is nothing. I can't imagine a single thing happening that would have me feel okay getting this vaccine. And whatever their answer is, we have to hear that and just respect that. But we want to do our job by at least asking the question and giving them a chance to feel safe giving us an answer. So I'm going to leave it at that. I want to hear what some of your thoughts or reactions are. And I also am really curious to hear sort of what your questions are about this, or where you think you want to hear more. We are scheduled to do sort of a part 2. Maybe someone else can speak to the date because I lost it. I had a piece of paper that said it, but I don't remember now. But coming soon, a part 2 of this. And I would love to be able to tailor it really to what you think would be most useful. So you can put thoughts, comments, feedback, questions in the chat. You can, I think they have the capacity to unmute themselves. You can just speak out loud to us. We have a few minutes, and I want to give you guys a chance to weigh in on some of this.
Thanks, Mia. And just to confirm, for all those on the line, you are able to unmute yourselves. And as Mia mentioned, we'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions to what was just shared. Or if there are things that you still have questions on, we would welcome those now too. So I will pause there. Feel free to unmute yourselves and share, respond, and the chat box is always open as well. Is there anything Mia shared that you are wondering more about, have additional questions on? Because as Mia said, we are going to do a second sort of follow-up part to this as well. So if there are things that you're unsure of, now's a great time to ask and pick her brain while we have her here.
So I really like how you all have been being careful not to speak on top of one another. That was maybe a less than 100% genuine affirmation, but in the silence, maybe someone is still typing a comment or a thought. But I guess I would just invite you to think about what's one thing that you heard in this little mini lesson. But what's one thing you heard or saw that you might want to try to put into practice or give it a try at least once? Maybe it's an affirmation, maybe it's one of these questions, maybe it's just the idea of, trying to listen a little more to the other person. What's one thing? And if you feel comfortable, you can type that one thing in the chat. If certainly you're not required to, but I'm going to invite you to, if you don't type it in the chat and share it with the larger group, at least write it down, because there is something about putting it, formalizing it in some way for yourself, will help a little more to sort of help translate that into an active thing you try.
If it's okay if I give a comment, although it does look like we just got something in chat, so I'll let you read chat.
Yeah, so it looks like there's a few comments in, so thank you for sharing your thoughts here. So there's one comment that says, I want to start asking what would need to happen for staff to feel ready to get the vaccine. So that sounds like the one sample question you included, Mia, hit the nail on the head for that individual. And then there was another comment about the biggest obstacle they have experienced is related to misinformation that's out there about safety and efficacy of the vaccine, and just acknowledging how hard it is to combat that, since we don't know where that information is coming from, or really how to explain that so-called fact isn't actually consistent with the source material. And so how do you kind of get through that while still having that trust as a foundation in some of those conversations?
Yeah, and one of the things that I have really just kind of tried to lean into, that has been an issue for me with a lot of the parents. I have sort of middle school age kids, and a lot of the parents that I've had conversations with. And, you know, what I've found to be useful to some degree is really just leaning into empathy for that. Like, gosh, you know, what a hard spot to be in. Because on one hand, you're hearing about all this, you know, potentially awful things with COVID. And on the other hand, you're hearing about all these really frightening things with the vaccine. And it sounds like you're kind of struggling to identify, where is my trusted source? What information can I rely on? And just acknowledging that for the person. And then, you know, doing a little problem solving, like, you know, asking them, well, where do you go to for other trusted information? And that has worked for a couple different parents that I had conversations with, and they ultimately identified their pediatrician as who they go to and who, you know, they feel like is someone they trust. And then they brought their concerns and their questions to their pediatrician to have a more of a conversation. Now, I don't know what the outcome of that conversation was, but just in terms of moving it forward toward a next step. But I don't think I would have gotten them even to a place of identifying, like, yeah, I could talk to my pediatrician's office about this, without first really leaning into empathy around how scary it is to be in that spot as a parent where you feel like you've got two choices and both of them are bad. And how do you make the decision about, you know, choosing the lesser of two evils? So I totally agree that mistrust and misinformation is such a challenge for us.
Absolutely. And Mia, thank you so much for providing us with some framework and background around motivational interviewing, giving us some solid steps to think about as we're having these conversations, and even providing some of these sample questions. I know even for me, as I look at this, I can think of a number of different conversations that these could be useful in, vaccines or otherwise. So I think this is a really strong framework. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Mia's contact information is included in the slides, so if you have additional thoughts or questions, please feel free to reach out to her. The slides again and the event survey have been posted in chat, so if you could take a minute to do that before you hop off, we would appreciate it. And then the last thing I will comment on before we close out today is our topic for next week. So we're going to start highlighting these at the end of each session, just so you know what's coming up next week. And if there are other folks that you want to get involved, you can plan accordingly. So next week, we will be talking about mobile vaccination clinics, and we hope you will be able to join us. So with that, thanks for hanging with us. We know we're a couple of minutes over. Thank you for all of the work that you're doing and that you continue to do. And Mia, we look forward to having you back for part 2 of this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you.